And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Beverly Francis. Beverly has been calling dances since, I believe, 1980, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, but she began learning as an apprentice then under the various esteemed ladies of country dance New York in the 80s. She has made a specialty of collecting Jane Austen information and is very clear on the dancing protocols of the time, what dances were done then, and what one did not do. So I'd like to welcome Beverly Francis, our caller emerita, to begin the dancing life and times of Jane Austen.
Well, thank you. Greetings. It's just over 2 years since I left New York for the heartland of Ohio. I have to say I'm happily settled. David and I enjoy the company of our family, and 3 grandsons makes things interesting. We enjoy English dance and contra with the local Columbus groups. We danced in Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and Ann Arbor, and I am happy to report that dance was thriving here in the Midwest, and it will thrive again. Just so, there is no doubt, though, I dearly miss dancing with Country Dance New York. Before I launch into this talk, because I suspect perhaps there are some real experts listening, I'll mention that I am not a dance historian. I am not a literary specialist in real life, but I am a life member of the Jane Austen Society of North America and a dance enthusiast of some 45 years standing. I love English country dance. I love Jane Austen, so we can talk. And here on our introductory slide, we see Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy wearing masks at the Netherfield Ball. And this is actually only one of many memes that have cropped up since the quarantine. A lot of writers seem to believe that Austen is the perfect quarantine author. Her characters are often 6 feet apart, and they make no physical contact. And we could go to the title slide for the next section. So here's a little introduction. Jane Austen was fond of dancing and excelled in it, states her brother and literary executor, Henry Austen. Accounts of balls are abundant in her letters, and dance scenes are prominent in each one of the 6 novels. And we could go to the next slide. Here is a portrait, the only confirmed portrait of Jane Austen, painted by her sister Cassandra. This sketch was modified in Victorian times to produce the view that we'll see on the next slide. We'll go to the next slide. Here is the recently issued 10-pound note in Britain. And her expression has been made a little more benign. She has ruffles on her cap. She has ruffles at her neck. And this is the image we see very often, but it's considerably modified from Cassandra's portrait. Jane Austen was born in 1775 in Steventon, a small village in Hampshire. She lived during the reign of George III and during the regency of the Prince of Wales. She died in 1817 at the age of 41. And here we have a list of her novels. The first 4 were published during her lifetime: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma. Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were published posthumously in 1817. Dance is part of every novel. There are informal dances at home, there are small town assemblies, balls in the spa town of Bath, and formal by invitation balls in stately homes. All of these scenarios have parallels in Jane Austen's own dancing life, and I hope to show you some of the connections that demonstrate that Jane Austen was writing about something that she knew intimately from personal experience. I'm going to flit about among Austen's letters and novels. If you've read her or watched some of the film adaptations, you'll recognize some of the scenes. If you have not read Austen, 6 great novels await. I can't think of a modern equivalent for the essential role dance played in English society. It was the social currency of its time. If you danced well, you carried yourself with ease and grace. and appropriate modesty. You demonstrated physical health and endurance. You could manage the etiquette of the ballroom with easy sociability. You could make proper introductions and honor your partner with fitting deference. You could navigate amiably through small talk and give undivided attention to a partner for the space of 2 dances. The ballroom was the place for Austen's characters to demonstrate their desirability as dance partners and possible marriage partners. Dancing well is the skill that she attributes to all of her heroes and heroines. But first, what might Jane Austen actually have danced? You can read more about this topic in the appendix to Graham Christian's The Playford Assembly, in Alison Thompson's new book, Dances from Jane Austen's Assembly Rooms, or on Susan de Guardiola's historic dance blog, Capers and Kickery. The Austen family would have danced country dances at home. We don't know how Jane actually learned to dance, but we can expect that some country dances were learned from her mother and her siblings. She and her sister Cassandra went away to boarding school for a few years, and dance would certainly have been part of that curriculum, which would be designed to educate an accomplished young lady. It's possible she learned the minuet at school, but it was becoming outmoded in the 1780s. It was still taught, though, to instill grace and good carriage. Cotillions were popular in her youth, as well as whole set dances like the boulanger, the only dance that is mentioned by name in either the novels or her letters. And in just a minute, we'll see this actual dance, but I'll tell you what else she would have danced. In addition to the boulanger, other whole set dances could include the Virginia reel. She may have danced Scotch reels, and this is what she did not dance: the minuet in any public setting, a partner turning waltz, heaven forfend, or quadrilles. So the boulanger, sometimes called the boulangère or the boulangerie, was a big circle dance with a traveling couple figure. It's mentioned in Pride and Prejudice, as well in letters by Jane Austen and her cousin Philadelphia Austen. And it was often done at the end of the evening because it was neither physically or mentally strenuous. And if you can imagine a huge circle in a 100-foot ballroom at Bath doing this, this dance could go on a while. We're going to see one round when Dorothy starts the video. So you saw the leading couple dancing and the lady turning each of the gentlemen around the ring and returning to her partner in between for a turn with him. And all the ladies would do that, then all the gentlemen would do it, and that would be the boulangère. And I think the reason Jane Austen mentions it by name is because it's not a long waist dance. It's a particular dance with a particular tune and a particular formation. Let's have the next title slide. And we will talk about dancing at home. Jane Austen would have danced at home with her brothers, possibly neighbors, and the boys who were boarding students of her clergyman father. And we have a sketch in the next slide, Dorothy, that is from a Regency sketchbook. The book is called Mrs. Hurst Dancing. And here we see a family dancing at home, possibly doing a reel for four. In Sense and Sensibility, we hear about Sir John Middleton, the Dashwoods' very gregarious neighbor, who organizes dances at his home for all the young people in the neighborhood. In Mansfield Park, there's a little dance that, quote, is thought of only in the afternoon, built on the late acquisition of a fiddler in the servants' hall. and the possibility of raising 5 couples, end quote. And in Persuasion, Jane Austen writes, the girls were wild for dancing, and the evenings ended occasionally in an unpremeditated little ball. So an informal dance at home was often called a ball, which is not the way modern dancers think of a ball, but it was a very expandable word for many settings. Often the music for these dances at home was supplied by an older lady, skilled at the piano and past the age of dancing. Austen writes to Cassandra in 1808, when the family is planning a move, yes, yes, we will have a pianoforte, as good a one as can be got for 30 guineas, and I will practice country dances, that we may have some amusement for our nephews and nieces when we have the pleasure of their company. And let's look at the next slide. This is Sally Hawkins playing Anne Elliot from Persuasion. And in this unhappy scene, Anne Elliot plays the piano, sometimes with tears in her eyes, as her lively younger companions are dancing. Her former suitor is assured that Anne is on the shelf at age 28 when they say, oh no, she has quite given up dancing. She had rather play. So that's a little bit about dancing at home. We can also think about local assemblies. And after dancing at home and at school, Jane Austen started dancing out at about the age of 17. Typically at the monthly assembly in the local market town of Basingstoke, she was now officially part of polite society. Assemblies combined dancing, cards, tea, and conversation. The dancing itself was considered an entertainment mainly for young folks. And in the next slide, oh, I forgot this one. In this slide, we're still at home, and here's a family preparing to go to Margate on a vacation. And cartoonists of the day had a heyday with subjects they believed were country bumpkins. And the dancing masters, you'll see him on the right, he's dancing in, were often thin and exhausted looking, and the local gentry were very stocky, frequently. So it's a French dancing master. There were a lot of emigres who came over to become dancing masters in England, and he's assuring these rural folks that they'll be fine at Margate, and they're doing very well. So now let's move on. Local assemblies, and we can go to the next slide. The Meryton Assembly in Pride and Prejudice. Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters attend the Meryton Assembly. We meet Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. On the left there, we see a sketch of the affable Mr. Darcy on the left and the somewhat aloof Mr. Bingley on the left, Mr. Darcy aloof on the right, and Bingley's 2 sisters and his brother-in-law. These are pictures by Hugh Thompson, who worked at the end of the 19th century. They aren't from the original publications of Jane Austen's novels. So the affable Mr. Bingley procures an introduction to Jane Bennet, the oldest Bennet sister, and over the course of the evening asks her for 2 pairs of dances, much to the delight of Mrs. Bennet, who is constantly on the lookout for marriage opportunities for her 5 daughters. Gentlemen were expected to dance with as many ladies as possible. And Mr. Darcy shows marked rudeness, and we'll see this on this picture on the right, by refusing to dance with Elizabeth Bennet, who is sitting out without a partner. And he says, within her hearing, that she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt him. In the 2005 film of Pride and Prejudice that stars Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadyen, we see the Meryton Assembly as a community evening filled with country bumpkin energy. The camera work emphasizes the closeness of the dancers. Their liveliness approaches levitation. The dance, and many New Yorkers and others will recognize it, it's the young widow a period-appropriate triple minor dance with a particularly jaunty tune. In reality, The Young Widow might be an unlikely choice in England because it's only found in American publications. But nonetheless, this is one of the few dances in any of the Austen film adaptations that approaches, I think, anything like historical accuracy. Since it's done as a triple minor, it has lively, if just a bit ungainly, footwork. So let's watch The Young Widow. The Young Widow. I think we can all agree those people knew how to have fun. Let's move on to the next title slide. Dancing at Bath. Bath, under the supervision of Beau Nash, was the resort for the smart set in the early 1700s. There was stunning architecture, there were the hot baths, there were 2 sets of assembly rooms, theater, music, and grand shopping. By 1790s, high society had moved on to Brighton and elsewhere, and Bath was more a spa for retired military and clergy. Mr. Austen, now a retired clergyman, moved there with his wife and his 2 unmarried daughters, Jane and Cassandra. And let's look at the next slide. This is a sketch by Thomas Rowlandson from a series called The Comforts of Bath. And of course, there's the crowd up dancing the long ways dance. There are observers to the right, and there's a huge orchestra pit down at the far end. The Bath assembly rooms, the upper rooms, which these are, survive today, although they were badly damaged in World War II and they've been reconstructed. And let's look at the next slide because you can see the similarity with the windows and the pilasters and the grand chandeliers. And the room is about 105 feet long. And here we have some modern, reconstruction type dancers having a ball. Austen attended assembly balls in Bath. And in 1801, she writes to Cassandra, "I had dressed myself as well as I could manage, and all my finery was much admired at home. By 9 o'clock, my uncle, my aunt, and I entered the rooms. Before tea, it was a rather dull affair. But then the before tea did not last long, for there was only one dance, danced by 4 couples. Think of 4 couples surrounded by about 100 people dancing in the upper rooms at Bath. After tea, we cheered up. The breaking up of private parties sent some scores more to the ball, and though it was shocking and inhumanly thin for this place, there were people enough to have made 5 or 6 pretty Basingstoke assemblies." In Northanger Abbey, our naive young heroine pays actually 5 visits to the upper and lower rooms. The master of ceremonies, Mr. King, introduces her to Henry Tilney, and Austen writes, "Catherine felt herself in high luck. There was little leisure for talking while they danced, but when they were seated for tea, she found him as agreeable as she had already given him credit for being." And let's look at the next title slide. Private balls. Dancing was part of many an evening party, often inspired by the discovery of a musician in the servants' hall. as happens with Fanny Price's first ball in Mansfield Park. Jane Austen and her characters refer to these little dances as balls. She describes, Jane Austen herself describes a small party in her letter of January 9th, 1799. There was the same kind of supper as last year, and the same want of chairs. There were more dancers than the room could hold, which is enough to constitute a good ball at any time. There were also formal balls by invitation, such as the Netherfield ball, or in Jane Austen's case, a ball at Hurstbourne, the nearby estate of Lord Portsmouth, who as a boy had been a somewhat backward pupil of Jane's father and lived in the Austen household. Jane Austen writes, "I believe I drank too much wine last night at Hurstbourne. I know not how else to account for the shaking of my hand today. It was a pleasant evening. There were only 12 dances, of which I danced 9 and was merely prevented from dancing the rest by want of a partner. We began at 10, supped at 1, and were back to Dean at 5. My partners were the 2 St. Johns, Hooper, Holder, and very prodigious Mr. Matthew, with whom I called the last, and whom I liked the very best of my stock. There were few beauties, and such as were there were not very handsome. Miss Iremonger did not look well, and Mrs. Blount was the only one much admired. She appeared exactly the same as she did in September, with the same broad face, diamond bandeau, white shoes, pink husband, and fat neck. The General has got the gout, and Mrs. Maitland the jaundice. Miss Deverry, Susan, and Sally made their appearance, and I was as civil to them as their bad breath would allow me. Mr. Bingley's Netherfield ball, the site of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy sparring on the dance floor, is one of Austen's grand private balls. The other takes place in Mansfield Park, where the autocratic Sir Thomas Bertram takes it into his mind to hold a ball to honor Fanny Price and give her a grand entrance into society. Fanny is the shy and impoverished niece of Lord and Lady Bertram, and being the center of attention brings her no joy. And we can look at the next slide. I was not expecting this slide, but that's okay. First, I'll just describe what happens to Fanny Price. The ball began. It was rather honor than happiness to Fanny, for the first dance at least. Her partner was in excellent spirits and tried to impart them to her, but she was a great deal too frightened to have any enjoyment until she could suppose herself no longer looked at. Now, here we have the ball at the Crown Inn in Emma, and New Yorkers may or may not recognize this picture as the one that was in the New York Times article about dancing with Country Dance New York. So we have Gwyneth Paltrow playing Emma and Jeremy Northern playing Mr. Knightley. And in a moment, we'll see a video from the 2020 Emma, in which Emma dances with Mr. Knightley. And in the novel and in the movies, the ball at the Crown Inn is the scene of some very interesting revelations. Emma finally recognizes her love for Mr. Knightley when she watches him dance and she dances with him. The tune here is Michael Turner's Waltz, dressed up for the film as Mr. Turner's Waltz. And dance analysts will notice there are 2 rounds of the tune, each with different choreography. So we have 64 bar dance. And interestingly, the progression is lost in the cutting of the scene. So let's take a look at Mr. Turner's Waltz.
I'm not embarrassing.
So there you have Emma dancing with Mr. Knightley. Dorothy and I agree that it's odd that whenever the heroine in these films dances with the hero, somehow she manages to ditch her gloves. Very risque. Let's see, let's talk about etiquette in the ballroom. So we have a title slide that follows, I believe. Oh, here is Fanny Price at the Mansfield Park Ball, and Henry Crawford is leading her to the top of the set, and you can see that she is not prepared to enjoy herself quite yet. So now let's go to the title slide, Etiquette in the Ballroom. Dancing manuals of the day and guides to good manners list many, many, many points to keep in mind in the ballroom, and here are just a few. One is dancing two dances together. And let's look at the next slide. Let's go ahead a slide and see, this is the one I want. Here is Marianne Dashwood with Willoughby. And in Sense and Sensibility, the dancing all occurs off stage in the novel. And when the wildly romantic Marianne hears from her neighbor that Willoughby once danced from 8 until 4 without ever sitting down, she is thrilled. Later, at evening parties, she and Willoughby flout all the rules and dance together all the time. When they're obliged to separate for a couple of dances, were careful to stand together and scarcely spoke a word to anyone else. Such conduct made them, of course, most exceedingly laughed at, but ridicule could not shame. It seemed hardly to provoke them, writes Jane Austen. So the custom, as we know, was to dance two dances with a partner and then move on. And even today, it would be remarked at a country dance if two people danced only with each other all evening. Let's go forward, Dorothy. Yes, this is where I want to be. Another point of etiquette is introductions. You couldn't converse or dance with somebody to whom you had not yet been introduced. So in Northanger Abbey, our heroine, Catherine Morland, arrives at the assembly rooms without knowing a single person. She couldn't converse, she couldn't dance without an introduction, so her first visit is somewhat disappointing. But on another evening, her luck improves. She is introduced to Mr. Tilney. And we see Catherine and Mr. Tilney on the left there, dancing an Alaman turn. They're introduced by Mr. King, the Master of Ceremonies, and he is mentioned in the novel, and he was a real-life Master of Ceremonies at the lower rooms and later the upper rooms. How the actual introduction was managed, Austen doesn't say, but I like to think that Mr. Tilney particularly requested it. And on the right, there's a picture from a stage production where Catherine is trying to deal with the other supplicant for her attention. This is John Thorpe, a young man more interested in horses and dogs than ballroom courtship. And Thorpe is actually the cause for a great deal of much ballroom unhappiness for Catherine. Jane Austen herself makes a particular mention in a letter of 1804 of being spoken to without an introduction. And she writes, "A new, odd-looking man who'd been eyeing me for some time, and at last, without any introduction, asked me if I meant to dance again." So there you are. And now let's talk about opening a ball. To open the ball and lead off the first dance was the privilege of the lady of highest standing. In Persuasion, Elizabeth Elliot, Anne's oldest sister, opens every ball. And it's said that Miss Elliot, for 13 winters revolving frosts, had seen her opening every ball of credit which the scanty neighborhood afforded. And let's go to the next slide. Here we have Mrs. Elton from the most recent 2020 Emma film. Mrs. Elton is the new bride of Highbury's vicar. She is seen by Emma as self-important, presuming, familiar, ignorant, and ill-bred. But she must be awarded the honor of opening the ball at the Crown Inn because she is the new bride. This is something Emma had assumed would be her privilege because she was the princessy centerpiece of all Highbury society. Austen writes, Emma must submit to stand second to Mrs. Elton, though she had always considered the ball as peculiarly for her. It was almost enough to make her think of marrying. And then in 1796, Austen describes a visit to relatives in Kent, and she says, we dined at Gunston and in the evening danced 2 country dances and the boulangerie. I opened the ball with Edward Bridges. So leading off the evening dances, even at a small family party, was worth a mention in a letter to her sister. For each dance, the lady at the top of the set possessed the call, and she would name the tune to be played and the figures to be danced. Modern dancers are accustomed to thinking of the tune and the dance as being inextricably linked. But in Austen's time, it was more like a menu. You would choose a tune, you would choose some dance figures. In an 1800 letter about the Hurstbourne ball mentioned earlier, Austen says that she called the last 2 dances. So the lead couple was expected to dance all the way down to the bottom of the set and then all the way back to the top as a supporting couple. And Jane Austen's nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, wrote in an 1871 memoir about his aunt. No little indignation was felt at the lower end of the room when any of the leading couples retired prematurely from their duties and did not condescend to dance up and down the whole set. So you can see there were rules and there were rules. Polite conversation was something else to know about. To navigate polite society, one was expected to have a repertoire of small talk. Talking would most likely have occurred while dancers waited out, not while they were actually dancing, in spite of what the films might show us. And there was plenty of waiting time in a long waist dance as all of the inactive dancers waited for the active couple to make their way down the set and draw them into the action. Elizabeth's dance with Mr. Darcy at the Netherfield ball includes this description. They stood for some time without speaking a word. She began to imagine that their silence was to last through 2 dances and was at first resolved not to break it, till suddenly, fancying that it would be the greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to talk, she made some slight observation on the dance. He replied and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, "It's your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance. You ought to make some kind of remark about the size of the room or the number of couples." And the sparring goes on from there at the Netherfield ball. And let's go to the next title slide. Let's talk about dance partners. Naturally, dancing with an agreeable partner was paramount. In her earliest surviving letter from 1796, Jane teases Cassandra, "I'm almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together." In Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins, the obsequious and unreliable vicar who is to inherit all of the Bennet property, has secured Elizabeth's hand for the first 2 dances well ahead of time. And Austen describes the dancing. Mr. Collins, awkward and solemn, apologizing instead of attending, and often moving wrong without being aware of it, gave her all shame and misery which a disagreeable partner for a couple of dances can give. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. And we've met Northanger Abbey's Catherine Morland. She tries to dodge John Thorpe at the assembly rooms while hoping for the arrival of Henry Tilney, because she knows which is the more desirable partner. And of course, Marianne Dashwood in Sense of Sensibility is completely entranced about really everything with Willoughby, including his dancing. Let's look at the next slide. So this is a cartoon, and you can see that the presumably obnoxious gentleman has actually stood on the lady's dress, but she's picked up her chair and she's moving off anyway. So there we have an undesirable partner. Jane Austen writes about her success or lack of dancing with an agreeable partner. In 1796, she says, "I danced twice with Warren last night and once with Mr. Charles Watkins. And to my inexpressible astonishment, I entirely escaped from Lyford. I was forced to fight hard for it, however." And in 1799, she writes, "One of my gayest actions was sitting down 2 dances in preference for having Lord Bolton's eldest son for my partner, who danced too ill to be endured." In 1800, she questions Cassandra's judgment at a ball and asks her, "Why did you dance 4 dances with so stupid a man?" And then later in 1800, there was a scarcity of men at a ball, and Austen dances with her friend Catherine Bigg for a number of dances. There was commonly a couple of ladies standing up together, but not often any so amiable as ourselves. And we have one more picture slide, Dorothy. Here is a cartoon by George Cruikshank from 1817 called La Belle Assemblée, or a sketch of characteristic dancing. And it's a little hard to see, but over on the far left, you can see the dancing master, exhausted, a group of 4 doing a country dance, and then with the tartan, a Scots reel, followed by an Irish jig. In the center, the lady with the feathers dancing a minuet, then a German waltz, then a French quadrille, then a Spanish bolero, and lastly, a ballet italien. The overhead pictures show things like dancing dogs, dancing bears, dancing horses, and over the musician's balcony, it says terpsichore and on the light, fantastic toe. There's one more slide. So there you have a taste of dancing in Jane Austen's time. The end. And thank you.
And thank you, Beverly. I had to stay muted so that my chuckling wouldn't be
Dorothy,
audible.
for me, you're muted.
Testing, testing.
It's
No?
good. Yeah, we
Yes.
hear you, Dorothy.
We hear you.
Okay, excellent. Beverly, it may be your speaker. Anyhow, I had to be muted so that I wouldn't be heard chuckling, because there's so many fun things in Austen stuff, and Beverly, you captured them so enjoyably well. Thank you very much. So we will proceed to Q&A.
Oops, you're,
Now you're muted, Dart. There you go.
try it
I
again.
had been muted, and now I'm back. This is our time for Q&A, and the way that we want to do this so that we have less of these muting issues is please place your question.
You're muted again, Dorothy.
I am not sure how I keep being muted, but I'm back again. Please type your question into the chat. This will work in both Zoom and in Facebook. And we, teching tonight's gathering will
She's gone muted again.
will report them on to Beverly. I'm not certain why I have been muted multiple times, but be warned, you might get muted. It happened to me. Okay, on to the questions. Paul, what have we from the chat box?
Well, we have a question. Did the dancers always know all the dances? For example, how did Mr. Knightley dance so well when he was known for not dancing at all? Beverly, did you hear the question?
Is Beverly muted, perhaps? And Helen, perhaps let us unspotlight so that we have a speaker showing up.
No, I can't hear anything.
We can hear you, Beverly. Everybody's unspotlighted, and if you quit sharing the screen, then we'll get a gallery view of everyone. You may have it on speaker.
Can you hear in your room?
Yeah.
We can hear you.
You should go to your room.
Can they hear you? You can hear me.
Yes.
I can give you a
In your bed?
We can hear you. Yes. Yes.
I'll put in your ear. You have to put this part in your ear.
Right.
The other ear. Yeah. Right. Yes.
There are David.
Goes in this ear, doesn't it? My right ear?
Yes.
Fun with Facebook and Zoom.
It's hard to do. Weird.
Close the screen sharing.
Yeah, Dorothy, you want to quit screen sharing?
There we go. Perhaps that will
You can
help
tell me
us.
to use my computer instead.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not really hearing anything in the ear.
Well, while we're waiting for Beverly to reassume what's going on, those of you who have questions for Beverly, please type them in the chat box. And the rest of us, I think that we can unmute and say hello for a moment. And actually, I will talk a bit about our next program while we're waiting. In 2 weeks from tonight, the third Thursday, we will have another country dance lore talk. Our speaker will be Paul Ross, who is kindly running tonight's door, and he will be speaking on the topic of Friet de Metz Herman, talking about her reputation and the reality. As someone who knew her for decades and personally, as well as in terms of her dance reconstructions and individual creations. He is well situated to speak to her legacy and to her as a person, as well as a creator. Okay, I think while we are waiting for Beverly,
I'm back.
she's back. Welcome back, Beverly. So sorry that you had trouble with sound.
This reason I lost all my sound.
You have two. We can hear you. We can hear you very well. In fact, I think you have two microphones on.
She's gone.
Can you hear us, Beverly?
There's no sound.
Oh, goodness.
Sorry.
I think she has to shut off her own and just use David's.
That was a question. I missed most of it because I had some technical difficulty.
We all thought we were dance organizers, but we're all becoming TV producers.
We are, yes. We're learning all kinds of ins and outs. And it's the really fun thing, as Helen can tell you for tonight, is when things change. Thank you, Facebook, for changing your interface at the last minute so that, surprise, We're not sure we're going to get to broadcast, but she pulled it out and we did it.
I was going to ask, hi guys. I was on a Zoom, I was on a work Zoom, and I missed a lot of this. Is it going to be rebroadcast somewhere?
It is being recorded. It will be accessible on Facebook and soon on Zoom as well. And the link for the Zoom, on YouTube. And the link for the YouTube will be posted at cdny.org.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And while we're paused here again, I'll just say that if you want to send me some feedback, you can route it via English program, that's all run together, lowercase, at cdny.org. So I propose the following. As we cannot hear Beverly now, let us open.
You can hear me, can't you?
Yes, we hear you twice. I believe you have 2 microphones on, Beverly.
Two microphones on.
You have the David Chandler and the Beverly Francis Zoom window.
We were hearing you fine through Beverly Francis, but you couldn't hear us.
Correct.
So maybe shut off your computer that you gave the presentation on, or mute it.
Or just the microphone.
Away from it now. But
well, we can.
Still picking up.
Echoing for you?
We can hear the echo, but I tell you what, we can hear you and you can hear us. So that's an advantage. And let us begin our questions. Paul, will you start us off?
I'd be happy to, unless Jean Talbot is able to unmute yourself. Jean, you had 2 interesting questions. Would you like to pose them to Beverly?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Greetings from San Diego, where we're having another 100-degree+ heat wave this week.
Oh dear.
But no fires. We're very lucky that way. So yes, Beverly, great presentation. Really enjoyed that so much. Thank you. So this has always confounded me. We don't hear a lot about, or maybe anything about, actually dancing lessons, having the dancing masters in the homes, in the novels of Jane Austen, and yet suddenly everybody shows up and they just all happen to know the dances. There's no calling, although in the cartoons that you posted, it was very interesting. They showed the dancing master. They're dancing along with his fiddle. You know, I guess he played the fiddle while he was dancing, and that was the easiest way to teach. So one question was that reality? Did the dancing master actually play while he was teaching? And the other is, how did people like Mr. Knightley, for example, he suddenly was able to dance so well when everybody knew, oh, he never dances?
Well, dancing masters had what they called pocket fiddles, and they held them low on their arm and danced along as they played. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet does say to Lydia that we had all the masters we needed, which probably would have included a dancing blackboard. Mr. Knightley, this is one of the great lacunae of dancing in Austen. As a gentleman, of course he would have learned to dance. And why is it for the 20-year Emma has never seen him dance? This seems like a gaping hole to me. And Emma herself, as a young lady of fashion, would have had a dancing master. You know, Jane Austen often doesn't bother to discuss the minutiae of daily life like that.
Well, it does seem that, you know, if Mr. Knightley had learned to dance 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, there would be some new country dances coming up, right? I mean, sometimes they did use dances from the late 18th century, but there would be a few coming up, especially maybe a few that they imported from France. And my other question was about Fanny Price, since, you know, they seem to neglect her so much, and yet she must have had dancing lessons, even though no one ever expected anything of her. And it seems like at Mansfield Park, that was her very, very first ball, and she has to lead it. So one, no wonder she's nervous, but two, how did she pull it off? You know, actually dancing at a ball, leading at a ball, and never having danced before.
Well, novels meant that she practices her steps in the parlor when she feels sure Mrs. Morris won't be about to give her a hard time. Her brother mentions how they used to dance in the street to the organ grinder, which would have been jumping about, something like we saw in the Meryton Assembly video clip. She did have the one little dance with the family where they discovered they had a fiddler in the servants' hall, but that would have been the extent of her experience in polite society. But again, off stage, her cousin Edmund might have taken pity on her and shown her a few things. And also, because she was leading the first dance, she could ask for a tune and ask for a set of figures that she knew. But yeah, it seems a little sketchy how suddenly she was able to lead off a ball.
So, Beverly, another question has come in regarding waltzing. When did waltzing become popular and accepted? If you believe Georgette Heyer, it was considered pretty fast for a while. And thank you, Sir Emmons, for that.
1814, I think, was the year they first waltzed at Almack's Ballroom in London. So that was its moment in polite society in England. It certainly wouldn't have made it out to the rural communities for a while. And for a long time, it was considered so risque, no respectable father would want his daughter to waltz. Does that help? So I'm not quite sure, actually, that it became a completely accepted couple ballroom dance.
Well, I was just wondering, you know, I mean, I love the Georgette Heyer books. I just didn't know how historically accurate they were. So it's kind of interesting to get that.
Well, if she's writing in London in 1814 and later, they would have waltzed in high society.
Okay, thanks.
This one from Ann Scher. Was there a rule about wearing gloves while dancing? We did remark that when they were not wearing gloves. What was the rule?
It was generally thought that both the gentleman and the lady should wear gloves. And it was suggested by some dancing masters that people should bring more than one pair of gloves in case the first pair got dirty on the dance floor. So gloves were certainly de rigueur.
This one is from David Millstone. Beverly, you shared illustrations from a later edition of one of Austen's novels. Were there illustrations in the first editions of her novels?
There were not. There are some wonderful books, one by Janine Barkas, B-A-R-C-H-A-S, about the different editions of the Jane Austen novels and what the covers were like and when illustrations came into play. The pictures I showed were by Hugh Thompson, and I think he was working in the very late 19th century or the very beginning of the 20th century. So he definitely was not from Jane Austen's own time.
Cool. Okay, this question from Erica McCready is going to get into your opinion. Which dancing, other than, I think it's which dancing of Pride and Prejudice adaptations is more accurate? Can you speak to the accuracy of the dancing that we've been seeing?
Oh, well, on the English Country Dance listserv, this is a frequent topic of conversation. And people are in a state of despair how the film productions pay so much attention to the costume and the homes and the food and the horses and the manners, and they completely ignore dance, as shown by Mr. Beveridge's Maggot being a favorite in several productions. And that's a dance from 1695. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to assume that dancers in 1810 would not wish to dance Mr. Beveridge's Maggot. It's like, you know, wearing your granny's knickers. You don't want to do that. You want to do what's popular in your time. So having said that, a number of the productions use older dances. There's Mr. Isaac's Maggot shows up in one of the Emmas. In the 1995 BBC production of Pride and Prejudice, Lydia calls out to Mary to play the piano. Oh, Mary, play Grimstock. And that's, you know, late 1600s. But other than that comment and the fact that they use Mr. Beverages for the big set piece in the Colin Firth, Elizabeth Ailey production, the other dances are all from the Apted collection, which is roughly 1780. So they didn't do too badly there. So those are the dances you see in the background at the party at Lucas Lodge.
Thanks. Okay, a question has come in from Beatrice Neary, and I believe she is on the call now. So Beatrice, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask this question, please do so. Not certain whether the mute key has been found, so I will read this. What she says, what I want to know is how rigid was the rule about siblings not dancing together as per chapter 38 of Emma, and here's a quote. You have shown that you can dance, and you know we are not really so much brother and sister as to make it at all improper. Brother and sister, no indeed.
Yes. There's a writer from Australia, Susanna Fullerton, who has spoken at many Jane Austen events and has a book called something like Going to the Ball with Jane Austen. And she speaks to this. And her feeling is that the ballroom was a place to look for a marriage partner. And you were not going to marry your brother. And not that they thought it was incest, but they just thought it was a waste of time to be dancing with a family member when you could be dancing with a potential future marriage partner. So that's what Susanna Fullerton has to say about it. But it does stand out in the novel. You think, what is she talking about?
I wondered that myself. I'm glad that question was asked. I've been asking questions that have shown up on the Zoom page. Are there any that have come in from Facebook that you can share with us, Helen?
Actually, Beatrice posted that one on Facebook, but then she switched over to Zoom. That's the only one I've seen, though.
Okay. I'm going to scroll through a moment to see that I haven't missed any other needed questions. And there was some interesting observations, Beverly, that you wouldn't have seen. David Millstone notes that La Boulangère is closely related to a Southern Appalachian figure called the shoe-fly swing.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it was news to me.
Dance, very similar.
Excellent.
I think it originates from a French folk dance.
La Boulangère, or just the figure?
La Boulangère.
Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I suspect that everyone has enjoyed themselves immensely hearing this presentation and looking at those pictures and seeing those videos and your observations on it, Beverly. I have been very much looking forward to this, and I've enjoyed it. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly. That was really enjoyable.
Absolute pleasure. I enjoyed it
a
myself.
wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Woohoo! Okay, well, we will now open it up. Feel free, everyone, to unmute yourself. And of course, you know, take turns talking. And we will move on to the social part of our evening. Once again, we will reconvene with Paul presenting a topic for us 2 weeks from tonight at 7:30. I hope you will join us, and I hope you had a nice time.